There is an ancient principle every empire learns too late. You cannot control the one who keeps you alive. For 75 years, the United States defied this fundamental truth. They built a system where Europe depended on its gas, its technology, its military protection. But this week, in Athens, that system collapsed. Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis signed an 8-year energy deal with Gazprom, guaranteeing Russian gas at €280 per thousand cubic meters, exactly 40% cheaper than US LNG. And when Joe Biden called angrily from Washington demanding explanations, Mitsotakis said 3 words that echoed across Brussels: "My citizens first." What corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this isn't an isolated deal. It is the collapse of the Atlantic energy monopoly that sustained US hegemony since 1949. I worked 5 years at the International Monetary Fund. I've seen this pattern repeat in 47 countries. First comes forced dependence, then manufactured crisis. Finally, the vassal's rebellion. And Washington is always shocked when the subjugated country chooses survival. Greece is repeating this cycle right now, and the fury inside the State Department isn't about democracy or European security. It's because Greece just proved the European emperor has no clothes, that sanctions against Russia are optional, that US gas is an economic scam, and that any country can leave the system if it has the courage to face the consequences. Let me show you exactly how we got here, because the story of US aggression against Greece didn't start this week. It began in 1967. For 57 years, the United States has treated Greece like a Mediterranean colony whose only purpose is to serve NATO interests. In 1967, the CIA orchestrated the colonel's coup, installing a fascist dictatorship that lasted 7 years because the democratically elected government of Georgios Papandreou was too close to Moscow. Declassified documents in 2018 confirm U.S. Ambassador Phillips Talbot had prior knowledge. Greek democracy was sacrificed to preserve NATO bases in the Aegean. In 2010, when the European debt crisis exploded, it wasn't the result of Greek irresponsibility. It was the result of Goldman Sachs helping the Greek government hide its true debt, using complex currency swaps to qualify for the euro. Christine Lagarde, then IMF director, imposed austerity programs that destroyed 25% of Greece's GDP in 5 years. Pensions slashed 40%, public salaries cut 35%, hospitals closed, schools without heating in winter, all to ensure German and French banks got their money back. And here's what no one mentions. The US controlled every IMF decision during that crisis. Every cut, every privatization required Treasury Department approval. The Troika, the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission forced Greece to privatize 50 billion euros in state assets. Who bought the port of Piraeus? China. The rail system? Privatized and sold to Italian companies. The state oil company? Dismantled. Greece was systematically stripped of economic sovereignty under US supervision. And when Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras tried to resist in 2015, calling a referendum where 61% of Greeks voted no to more austerity, he was forced to capitulate within a week. The message was clear. Your democracy doesn't matter. Your citizens don't matter. German bonds matter. Now comes the truly perverse part. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US demanded Europe immediately cut all Russian gas. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission and obedient executor of Washington's will, announced the 6th sanctions package: 0 Russian gas imports by the end of 2022. The replacement? US LNG at 4 times the price of pre-war Russian gas. Germany shut down Nord Stream and started paying $2,000 per thousand cubic meters for US gas, when it had been paying $300 for Russian gas. Europe's energy bill rose 450 billion euros in 1 year. German industry began collapsing. BASF shifted production to China. Volkswagen closed plants. And the US celebrated, because it had finally broken Europe's energy dependence on Russia, replacing it with dependence on the United States. But Greece looked at the numbers and chose differently. Mitsotakis did the math. His country had already been looted for a decade by the IMF. The economy was barely recovering. And now Washington wanted Greece to pay an extra 6 billion euros per year in energy costs to satisfy US foreign policy, to punish Russia for a war in Ukraine that doesn't directly threaten Greece, while Greeks were still suffering from austerity imposed by the US. So what happened? Something the State Department never thought possible. A NATO member, a European Union country, decided its economic survival mattered more than US containment policy. And in October 2024, Greek ministers quietly flew to Moscow. No announcement, no consultation with Brussels, no permission from Washington. They negotiated directly with Gazprom. Right now, Victoria Nuland, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, is furious. Not officially. Officially, the State Department issued a statement expressing concern about reliance on unreliable energy sources. But unofficially, sources inside the National Security Council say Biden personally called Mitsotakis and threatened consequences. What consequences? That's the problem. The U.S. has no real leverage. It cannot sanction Greece without wrecking NATO cohesion. It cannot expel Greece from the EU. It cannot blow up the pipeline like Nord Stream. It runs through Turkish territory, and Turkey is already buying Russian oil. The U.S. is trapped in a strategic nightmare of its own making. Because here is the truth Washington cannot admit. It turned Europe into an economic hostage, and the hostage just discovered the ropes are loose. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm promised the U.S. could fully replace Russian gas in Europe. It was a lie. The U.S. produces 100 billion cubic meters of LNG for export annually. Europe needs 150 billion just to replace Russian gas. The math never worked. It was a con. And now, when Greece buys Russian gas at 280 euros, while Germany pays $700 for US LNG, the whole continent is watching. Poland is considering reopening talks with Gazprom. Hungary never stopped buying Russian gas. Slovakia just signed a transit agreement. The sanctions wall is cracking, and the US can't afford to subsidize it. Congress rejected a 12 billion euro European energy subsidy package. The U.S. Treasury is struggling to finance a $2 trillion deficit. Janet Yellen needs China, Japan, and Europe to buy treasuries just to keep the government operating. You can't declare war on your banker. You can't sanction the countries financing your debt. And you certainly can't force impoverished allies to buy overpriced gas when they have a 40% cheaper option next door. Washington now faces its worst nightmare. A rebellious vassal proving disobedience is possible. Because if Greece can defy sanctions without severe consequences, why not Italy? Why not France? Why not Germany? The U.S. experiment of turning Europe into a captive market for overpriced gas is collapsing in real time. Let's bring in John Mearsheimer, professor at the University of Chicago, and arguably the most important living international relations theorist. He has warned for 3 decades that U.S. hegemony is unsustainable. His offensive realism theory predicts exactly what we're seeing in Greece. States act according to survival, not ideology. And when a weakened hegemon imposes unsustainable costs on allies, those allies search for alternatives. This isn't betrayal. It is the brutal logic of power politics. Mearsheimer wrote in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics that empires collapse not when defeated militarily, but when their vassals realize loyalty costs more than protection. Greece just did that math. The cost of obeying Washington, 6 billion euros per year in higher energy costs, outweighs any protection against non-existent threats. Russia isn't invading Greece, but Washington will let Greece freeze or go bankrupt to maintain its containment policy. Political scientist Alexander Wendt adds another layer. Alliances are social constructions. They exist only while participants believe in them and behave accordingly. The moment Greece signed that Gazprom contract, the social construction of Atlantic solidarity fractured. No matter how loudly Brussels and Washington insist Europe is united, behavior reveals truth. And Greece's behavior shows the Western alliance is now transactional, not ideological. Now watch what is collapsing systemically. Two pillars sustained U.S. hegemony since 1971. The petrodollar, oil traded in dollars, forcing nations to hold dollar reserves. U.S. treasuries, foreign countries financing U.S. deficits. Both pillars are being destroyed, and Greece just accelerated it. Think about it. When Greece buys Russian gas, in what currency does it pay? Not dollars. Russia was cut off from SWIFT in 2022. Greece pays in euros. Gazprom converts euros to rubles through Chinese banks. The US loses another dollar-denominated energy transaction. Multiply that across Europe, the demand for dollars falls. When dollar demand falls, the dollar weakens. And when the dollar weakens, US inflation explodes. Here comes the second pillar cracking. The U.S. Treasury must sell $2 trillion in bonds this year. Who used to buy them? Japan, China, Europe. But Japan is in recession and selling treasuries to defend the yen. China cut its holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $816 billion in 2024. Europe is going broke paying inflated energy prices. Where exactly is the money supposed to come from? Europe cannot finance U.S. deficits while paying inflated prices for U.S. gas. The math doesn't work. And here's the devastating irony keeping Pentagon strategists awake. The U.S. forced Europe into an impossible dilemma. If Europe obeys sanctions and buys expensive U.S. gas, economies collapse and they can't buy treasuries. If Europe defies sanctions and buys Russian gas, sanctions collapse, U.S. authority evaporates. The U.S. loses either way. Meanwhile, BRICS is building the alternative. Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa invited Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE in January 2024. The bloc now represents 47% of global population and 36% of global GDP. They are building a swift alternative, a commodity-backed reserve currency, and bilateral energy deals outside the dollar system. When Greece signed with Gazprom, it didn't just buy cheap gas. It sent a signal to 193 countries. You can leave the US system. Sanctions are optional. Hegemony has cracks. We are witnessing imperial liquidation, not dramatic collapse, but thousands of small defections, each country making rational survival choices. And suddenly the empire wakes up and realizes no one is obeying. Are you enjoying the analysis? If this content is opening your eyes to reality's corporate media hides, subscribe now. Join the 47,000 people waking up. Like the video so the algorithm shows it to others. Comment where you're watching from. We are building a global community. Now let's talk about what this means for you, because this isn't just about Greece and Russia, it's about your economic future. When the dollar system collapses, when treasuries lose buyers, when U.S. hegemony disintegrates, Washington has only two choices: default or inflation. History shows they always choose inflation. Default means admitting defeat. It would end dollar reserve status instantly. No U.S. administration will choose that. So they print. The Federal Reserve expands money supply to buy debt foreigners won't. Every printed dollar dilutes the value of dollars already in your bank account. Your savings will pay for saving the empire. When your supermarket raises prices 15% next year, it won't be supply chains. It will be dollar devaluation. When your power bill rises 25%, it won't be grid failure. It will be Washington subsidizing overpriced LNG while losing control of global energy. When gas hits $6 a gallon, it won't be oil shortages. It will be the petrodollar dying. This is already happening. U.S. inflation averaged 6.2% in 2023 versus a historical 2%. But official numbers lie. Using the 1980 method, inflation would be above 12%. Food, energy, housing rising faster than wages. And it will worsen as the system that let the U.S. export inflation ends. Here's the good news. You don't have to be a victim. BRICS rising, Europe fracturing, Greece defying Washington, all create opportunity for people who understand what's coming. Real assets, commodities, investments in countries on the winning side of the multipolar shift. But only if you act before everyone else understands. Watch what's happening. Watch who signs deals with whom. Greece with Russia, Saudi Arabia with China, Brazil with India. These aren't anomalies, they are signals. The transition has already happened. The world just hasn't realized it yet. But you will, when the next financial crisis hits, when NATO fractures, when the dollar loses another 20% and your savings evaporate. You'll remember you saw this. Someone warned you. Stay alert, stay informed. Understand that every geopolitical move connects directly to your wallet. Greece's deal with Russia isn't just about gas. It is about the collapse of a 75-year system that kept the U.S. on top. And when that system falls, the shockwaves hit every bank account, every pension, every paycheck in the Western world. You are witnessing the foundations of the world order being rearranged. Don't say nobody warned you.